Point 1. Talking ain't easy. Let's talk about strangers. You know, those folks we bump into at the grocery store or sit next to on the bus. We don't know them from Adam, but our brains are quick to size them up. We take a look, make a snap judgment, and think we've got them figured out. But here's the thing, that's not always the best way to go about it. Why? Well, every person has a story, a whole life that's shaped them into who they are. When we meet someone new, we don't see that story. We just see the cover. And judging a book by its cover? That's where we can get into trouble. So, what's the solution? We got to put in the work. We got to dig a little deeper, question our first impressions, and look for more clues. It's like being a detective. But instead of solving a crime, we're trying to understand a person. Now, here's another thing to consider. We humans have a habit of taking things at face value. If someone tells us something, we tend to believe it, unless there's a glaring reason not to. This is called default to truth. It's a handy shortcut most of the time, but when it comes to strangers, it can trip us up. Even pros like cops and spies, who are trained to spot a fib, can get fooled. So, how do we get better at dealing with strangers? We've got to approach these encounters with a bit of humility and caution. We've got to admit that our first impressions might be off and be ready to change our minds when we get new info. We've also got to keep an eye on our default to truth habit and be a bit more skeptical about what we're told. In a nutshell, chatting with strangers isn't as easy as it seems. It takes effort, a bit of critical thinking, and a willingness to question our own assumptions. But if we can do that, we'll be better equipped to navigate these interactions and avoid a whole lot of misunderstandings. Point 2. Be kind always. In the tragic tale of Sandra Bland, a young African-American woman, we're reminded of the importance of compassion when dealing with strangers. Bland's story begins on an average day, driving to the supermarket. She was pulled over by a police officer, Brian Encinia, for not signaling a lane change. At first, the interaction was polite. Encinia asked Bland a few questions, which she answered. But things took a turn when Bland lit a cigarette in her car. Encinia asked her to put it out, and when she refused, he became angry. This led to a heated argument, Bland's forceful removal from her car, and her subsequent arrest. Sadly, Bland took her own life in her jail cell just 3 days later. Her death, especially in light of the recorded interaction with Encinia, sparked a lot of debate. This happened during a time when reports of African Americans dying in police custody were on the rise, leading to the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which fights against systemic racism and police violence. Bland's case stirred up a lot of emotions. Some people saw it as part of a larger issue of racial injustice. Others focused on the specifics of Bland and Encinia's interaction, questioning the officer's motives and actions. In this context, it's important to remember that while some police officers may act with ill intent, others may unintentionally act on their biases. This is where compassion comes in. By showing compassion, we can better understand others' viewpoints and avoid misunderstandings that can lead to tragic outcomes. The call here is for us to be more understanding and empathetic when dealing with strangers. By doing so, we can help prevent tragedies like Bland's and work towards a more fair and equal society. Point 3. People are puzzles. In Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell delves into the intriguing world of human behavior and perception, particularly when it comes to our interactions with people we don't know. One of the key takeaways from his exploration is the idea that we often think we know strangers better than they know us. This is what he calls the illusion of asymmetric insight. To bring this concept to life, Gladwell shares an experiment led by Professor Pronin. The experiment involved a simple word completion task. Participants were given a word with missing letters like B__K and asked to fill in the blanks. They could choose any word they liked, such as book or beak. After the task, Professor Pronin asked the participants if they thought their word choices said anything about their personalities. Most shrugged off the idea, attributing their choices to chance rather than any deep personal meaning. But here's where things get interesting. When these same participants were shown the word choices made by strangers, they suddenly started reading into them. They began to assign personality traits based on these word choices, even though they had earlier dismissed the idea that their own choices could reveal anything about them. For instance, A participant who saw that a stranger had chosen beak instead of book for B_K concluded that the stranger wasn't much of a reader and was easily distracted. This was the same participant who had earlier denied that their own word choices could reveal anything about them. This tendency to think we can understand strangers better than they can understand us is a mental shortcut our brains use to deal with the overwhelming amount of information we encounter every day. It's easier for our brains to put people into neat little boxes based on limited information, even if these boxes aren't entirely accurate. This illusion of asymmetric insight can make us feel like we have the upper hand in social interactions. We feel like we have the edge because we think we understand others better than they understand us. But, as Gladwell points out, this illusion can lead to misunderstandings and miscommunications. To avoid this, we need to be more self-aware and introspective. We need to remember that other people's lives are just as complex and nuanced as our own, and that we can't fully understand someone based on limited information. By keeping this in mind, we can communicate more effectively with strangers and reduce the chances of misunderstandings. Point 4. First impressions stick. First impressions are a big deal. They're not just about that initial handshake or hello, but also about the snap judgments and assumptions we make from that first meeting. Let's take a trip back in time to illustrate this. Picture British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler in the run-up to World War II. Chamberlain had a few sit-downs with Hitler and walked away thinking Hitler was a man who kept his word. He was so sure of Hitler's honesty that he put pen to paper on the Munich Agreement in 1938, thinking it would keep war at bay. But, as we all know, Hitler didn't stick to his word and World War II kicked off, showing Chamberlain's first impression was way off the mark. This historical hiccup is a stark warning about the dangers of putting too much stock in first impressions. Chamberlain wasn't a fool, nor was he inexperienced. His mistake was a common human error, thinking we can size someone up based on a few interactions. This isn't just about world leaders and war, it's about everyday situations too. Think about hiring a new employee. Companies put candidates through the ringer with multiple interviews, watching their every move, listening to their answers, and trying to get a read on their personality and skills. But, just like Chamberlain's take on Hitler, these first impressions can sometimes lead us astray. Another tale worth telling is that of Lord Halifax, another British bigwig who initially mistook Hitler for a servant. This story just goes to show how our first impressions can be swayed by how someone looks, acts, and the circumstances in which we meet them. So, what's the takeaway here? It's important to remember that our ability to read strangers based on first impressions has its limits. Sure, they can give us some clues, but they're not always spot on and can lead to some serious mix-ups and missteps. That's why it's so important to keep an open mind and a healthy dose of skepticism when meeting new people. Point 5. Spotting lies is tough. In Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell hammers home the point that spotting a lie isn't as easy as we might think. It's not just about catching fibs in a friendly chat, but it's also about those high-stakes situations where a lie can have serious, even catastrophic consequences. To drive this point home, Gladwell shares the real-life tale of Ana Montez, a top analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency (DI) in the U.S., who was later unmasked as a spy for Cuba. This story is a textbook example of how tough it can be to sniff out a lie, even in a professional environment where folks are trained to do just that. Let's rewind to February 24, 1996. Two planes from the humanitarian group Brothers to the Rescue were shot down by Cuban pilots. This group was known for helping Cubans flee the harsh rule of Fidel Castro. The investigation, led by military counterintelligence analyst Reg Brown, pointed the finger at Ana Montez as the one who spilled the beans about the plane's movements to the Cubans. Despite the evidence, Brown struggled to accept that Montez, a respected co-worker, could be a spy. He wrestled with this shocking revelation for weeks before finally spilling his findings to Scott Carmichael, a DIA counterintelligence officer. Carmichael, too, found it hard to swallow. He personally grilled Montez, picked apart her alibi, and even combed through her file with a fine-tooth comb. He found no evidence or anything fishy that could suggest she was a spy. No booze problems, no money issues, no red flags whatsoever. Montez was even on the short list for a promotion to the director's position. Yet behind the scenes, she had been spying for Havana since her first day at the DIA. Eventually, Montez was nabbed, and secret codes were discovered in her bag, which she used to send messages to Cuba. She also had a radio stashed in a shoebox in her closet for communication. Every night, after wrapping up her work at the DIA, Montez would jot down all the info she could recall from the day to pass on to the Cuban government. This story really hammers home the point that spotting a lie isn't as easy as pie. In the world of fiction, spies are often painted as super talented folks who can effortlessly hide their true intentions and lead double lives. But in real life, they're just regular Joes and Janes who are good at keeping secrets. The real challenge is our natural tendency to trust people, which often blinds us to the possibility of deception. It usually takes a big event or revelation to jolt us out of this comfort zone and make us see things in a new light. Point 6. There's more than a smile. In Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell takes us on a deep dive into the intricacies of human interaction, especially when it comes to deciphering the actions of those we don't know. He points out a key flaw in our understanding of others. We put too much stock in facial expressions, and this can lead us astray. Let's break it down. We often judge people by their outward behavior. If someone's charismatic and has a strong handshake, we might think they're confident. If they're always smiling, we might see them as friendly. But if they seem nervous or stumble over their words, we might label them as untrustworthy. This is because we tend to believe in transparency, the idea that what you see is what you get. Our trust in transparency is often reinforced by the media. Think about it. In movies and TV shows, emotions are often overplayed for drama. A surprised character might gasp and widen their eyes in shock. We get used to these exaggerated reactions and start expecting them in real life. But as psychologists Occam Schutzwohl and Rainer Reisenstein showed in a study, real-life reactions are usually more subtle and harder to spot. Psychologist Tim Levine adds another layer to this puzzle by suggesting that certain nonverbal behaviors can hint at deception. For example, a liar might blink more often because lying puts a strain on their brain. They might also show fewer facial expressions, or their expressions might not match their words. But these signs aren't foolproof, and they can easily cause confusion. A liar might act in a way that seems honest, while a truth teller might come off as dishonest. So, what's the takeaway? While facial expressions and nonverbal cues can give us some clues about what a person is thinking or feeling, they're not always reliable. As Gladwell points out, we need to be aware of these limitations and tread carefully in our judgments, especially when it comes to strangers. Point 7. Booze messes with your brain. In Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell takes us on a deep dive into how alcohol messes with our decision-making abilities. It's not just a casual observation, but a profound look into our psychology, especially when we're a bit tipsy. To paint a picture, Gladwell brings up an interesting tidbit about the Aztecs. They had a local brew called pulque, which translates to 400 rabbits. It's a quirky way of saying that alcohol can make us act in all sorts of unpredictable ways. It's a cultural metaphor that shows how booze can change our behavior and decision-making. Gladwell then brings in the big guns, psychologists Claude Steele and Robert Josephs. They came up with the term alcohol myopia. It's a fancy way of saying that alcohol makes us short-sighted. When we're drinking, we tend to focus on the here and now, forgetting about the bigger picture or the long-term effects. This tunnel vision can lead to some pretty bad decisions. For example, you might think that a few drinks will help you shake off a bad mood. Sure, alcohol can give you a temporary high, but this narrow view ignores the potential fallout, like feeling even more anxious or down once the buzz wears off. Where you drink also matters. If you're at a high-energy football game, the thrill of the match can distract you from your worries. But if you're alone in a bar with nothing to distract you, you might end up feeling more anxious and making poor decisions. Alcohol can also mess with how we see ourselves. It can make us take our assumptions too seriously, which can lead to conflicts. Some people think that alcohol brings out their true selves, but really, it just stops us from thinking about the long-term consequences of our actions. Finally, Gladwell talks about the physical effects of alcohol, especially when you drink too fast. Alcohol can mess with the hippocampus, the part of your brain that helps form memories. This can lead to blackouts, where you can't remember certain details or even whole events. This can further mess up your decision-making. In a nutshell, Gladwell's deep dive into how alcohol affects our decision-making is a mix of anthropology, psychology, and biology. It's a reminder of how important it is to understand the many ways alcohol can affect our behavior and decisions, especially when we're dealing with people we don't know well. Point 8. Conclusion. Understanding and communicating with strangers is a complex process that often leads to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. Our default to truth often blinds us to the reality of a person's character, leading us to trust when we shouldn't and doubt when we should trust. Transparency. The belief that people's behavior and demeanor reflect their underlying emotions and intentions is often misleading. People's actions and expressions are not always a clear window into their thoughts and feelings. The concept of coupling teaches us that behaviors are linked to specific circumstances and contexts. Understanding this can help us better predict and prevent negative outcomes. In a world where we increasingly interact with strangers, it's crucial to approach these encounters with caution, humility, and a willingness to question our assumptions. By doing so, we can improve our ability to understand and communicate with the people we don't know. Remember, it's not about judging a book by its cover, but about reading every page with an open mind and a willingness to understand.